Hi and welcome back. Next speaker, a very interesting person. He's extremely experienced within the QA/RA field. He works as a senior advisor within his own consultancy firm. He's also chairman of the organization Swedish MedTech. Now, Peter Löwendahl, he will talk about the importance of fulfilling the MDR and IVDR regulations. Time is almost running out, and he will give you some pointers and some tips and hints on what approach to take and how to deliver on these regulations. So a warm welcome to Peter Löwendahl.
Thanks, Rian, and also thanks for the opportunity to speak at this conference. It will be a pleasure to talk with things I like the most: quality and regulatory affairs issues, and how I can secure predictable and sustainable market access for my customers. And of course, that's something we share among all the people in the crowd also. How do we secure that we can get safe and effective products out in the marketplace to ensure that we can treat patients? For many people, of course, the MDR and IVDR is something which most people have talked about and heard about. But it also means that lots of things needs to be done in the companies to actually achieve what is required from the regulation itself. And even though it's important to remember that there have been delays in this part, and I think one of the key things when it comes to the regulation is that if the COVID pandemic have not been happening, lots of these things already have been forced to be in place. But due to that, lots of change have happened. And there are also recently been other changes there. Right now, then just glance through who I am, so you know who I'm talking about. And that's, of course, very important when you think about what I'm discussing today. But skip that part. The new regulation, actually, it's not that new, to be honest. I've been around now for close to 5 years, so most of you should have had the chance to read through it. And for the ones which have class 1 product according to MDR, the lowest risk products, of course this is already applicable. You have to follow it already, except for a few other products where you actually have the possibilities to have a transition period. And that means that the companies with higher risk products already have a notified body certificate. Of course, you have longer transition times for this, but also for class 1 products which are upgraded in the new regulation, you can still use the transition period. The same thing goes for IVDR. It's soon mandatory for most products, but just recently the EU came up with a suggestion to delay the implementation of this. And this, of course, most welcome news, because clearly the number of notified bodies in this area is not that many. And hence it's would be a really bad situation for patients and companies out there if this would not be true. So I think that was really good news that they finally have come up with a suggestion how to do this. And we'll come back to it a bit later on what that means in practice. So what is the big buzz about? The most what we in the Swedish MedTech organization, MedTech Europe, etc., talking about is the lack of number of notified bodies around. And notified bodies is a key player in getting the puzzle together. Without the notified body for higher class of product, you can't actually be on the marketplace. And even though there are a few notified bodies around, it's currently 6 notified bodies for the IVDR, and it's 20 plus for MDR. But if you can see on this graphs here, which comes from the notified body group, and that means that the number of certificates, MDD certificates, and the ones that are using basically transition period, basically are expiring in 2024. And this means that the workload will be tremendous high for the notified bodies going forward. And if you put in the graphs on the available capacity, how it looks like now, there are a big gap between what the notified body have capacity for right now versus the need out there. And of course, it will be more notified bodies approved out there after a few years more. But the problem is still that there are not enough with resources. And I think the problem here is that to be able to actually handling all the expiring certificate 2024, most notified bodies need to have the documentation from the companies in early 2023 to be able to handle that workload. So it's not that even though 2024, end of 2024 is seems to be far away, it's basically just more than like a year away. They need to actually have the application, have the data in place. And of course, that's a huge burden. With a new suggestion that came out recently then about delaying IVDR, at least that part will look a little bit better. Companies will be able to sell CE marked products, which was put on the market before 26th of May 2022. They will be able to sell that from depending on class until 2024 up to 2028. So there are possibilities there, but still there are some other challenges which I will also come back to, even though you have some possibilities to delay the implementation. And the key thing here is that the regulations should already have been in place. I mean, if it haven't been for the pandemic, they should always be up running. And I think one of the key problem here, of course, is that lots of companies are delaying the implementation because of the new delayed dates. And of course, that will in the end not be that good. Technical documentation, you should have that ready already today, I would say. The quality system way of working is also something that already should be in place. And if you don't have that in place, you are really behind. Especially sometimes technical documentation, there are higher requirements on like clinical evaluation data, how you show the product compliance. There are higher requirements, which means that when the notified body will look into your files, they will have a completely different level of detail when they go through it than today. If you have an MDD notified body, it's a huge difference, I would say. And I have had customers which actually had a good MDD file, which I thought was good, and they got more than 1,000 questions when they actually sent in for MDR review. So I think there can be lots of surprises for some companies there. And the same thing with the quality systems. It's also important to ensure that you actually drive a system that you can utilize things from, because if you just put the system in place which meets all the regulatory needs, you might have a system that you can't really use in a good way to drive the way of working, to drive the efficiency in the business. Everyone can put the quality system that meets all the requirements in place, but you also need to be able to work according to that, because otherwise you get out of business anyway. And this also is one of the key things here is also software systems around that, because if you have software system and need to have that in place, you need also to validate the different systems in a good way. So that's also very important. What lots of companies still have not understood is that under this time when you can actually sell the product according to the old regulation, you're not allowed to do significant changes, and you cannot sell new products, which means that if you didn't release the product before the deadline of the MDR, which was in May this year, and for IVDR before May next year, then you can't actually release new products, and you can't do significant changes. And I think lots of management in the companies have not really realized that. So that why a company not show the new device on the exhibition? No, because you can't put out a new device on the market because you don't have MDR certificates yet. And this is a huge challenge for many companies. So therefore, even though you have a long transition period to do this, in reality, if you want to come out with new products, the transition period is very short for lots of companies. And especially if you're a company which have products where the transition period is shorter due to that the main part of the business is selling new devices and changes of the devices, then you're in a quite bad situation right now. There you could say that there are also other things. The new things in these regulations is partly, which lots of companies already have in place for US then, but it's the UDI requirements. How do you actually ensure that the unique device identification and product identification data is handled in the right way? And typically, if you have lots of products, it's a must to have some kind of software system to handle this data. If you don't know how to handle it, it can create a big mess. Because here you need to have data on each product in longer term. Right now it's only on the device level, but then you need to have it on each individual product. And that, of course, will put lots of stress on the systems you're using. Paperwork type of system will only work if you have a few products, I would say, and that's probably not recommended in the long term. At the same time, I think there have been lots of changes due to the pandemic where people are working more remote than the past, which probably is a good thing in many cases. But that also means that you need to have a quality system. You need to have all kind of software system that actually works remote. And especially if you talk about quality system, the easiest way, if you don't have a good system, is to have a paper-based system with signatures. But that, of course, means that you can't work remote at all, because if you need to sign documents paper-wise, then you're in trouble. So I think every company also need to think about that. Probably in the future, it will be more people that want to work remotely. And I think also that to get the right competence, this is also a key part of companies. But then you also need to have the systems supporting this. And of course, these systems also need to be validated that they actually work as intended. And at the same time, when you put in all these new requirements of loads of new type of data, which you might have not worked with before, you need to have good processes to work with these things. If you put in a new computerized system, you need to ensure that the system actually are implemented in the way you want to work. And sometimes I think also just change things in the system might not work. It's also ensure that actually the software vendors typically have a good process for these kind of things because they have worked with it many years. So my advice here would be that it's probably a good thing to actually follow what the software manufacturers tells you to follow, because they have tried it out, and not try to do too many adjustment of the systems, because that's typical can hit you later on. So what are the key changes and problems in the regulation then? The biggest changes is actually for the lowest class products, the one which already needs to meet MDR. And basically in the IVDR regulation, these changes applies to all products basically, except for very few high-risk class products. And this means that every single company now needs to have a quality system in place. It doesn't need to be certified for class 1 product, or you don't need a notified body for it, but at least you need to have a complete set of quality procedures, and you need to follow that kind of procedures. So this means that things which in the past you didn't need to have any documentation for, you need to have documentation for right now when you follow the IVDR or MDR regulation. And of course, this also means that you need to have more systems in place to be able to handle this. For smaller companies, few employees, it might be worth to have it on paper, but if you have more products, if you have different ways to handle this, it will be very complicated to do this on paper, I would say. Still, the key changes in the regulations is the need for notified bodies have increased quite a lot, and that's also the big bottleneck here. As I discussed before, the number of notified bodies out there is much far lower number than needed for actually satisfy the needs for this. And therefore make sure that you start to work on this, if not already done. Start earlier than you think. It will take time. The queue time in queuing up on the notified body part is high, and lots of the notified bodies actually have issues to actually handle their customers. So don't rely on that they already have one of the bigger notified bodies for MDD. They need to have time to actually to handle your submission. They need to have time to actually review your technical documentation, etc. And I think in most of my customers, at least, which have been through this process, you're talking about 300 days to get the technical documentation reviewed. And these guys have had good technical documentation files. And if you have bad files, you probably will need to reapply several times before you actually get through this process. It can take a long time here. Overall, then, you could say that the biggest hit is probably on the startups. And the reasoning being that in the past, startup company with a class 1 product, typical app company, for instance, they didn't need to have a quality system. They didn't need to have that much documentation. They could start up easy to get out the product there and then fill up with the documentation needed. But now then they need to actually show that the development of the app following the quality system, they need to have everything in place before they actually put on the CE marking. And you could say that's probably a good thing in the long term. But of course, there are lots of things a startup needs to do anyway. And of course, if it's a complex startup company where they have complex products like class 3 products, then this process can be very burdensome and costly because there are much more tighter rules for clinical evaluations, clinical trials, also rules for actually doing performance tests out on the hospitals. So there are much more hurdles, and it probably takes much longer time and costs more money than it used to do 10 years ago. So that's something also to remember here. So some considerations to manage this process. Time is limited. And we know that time is running for MDR. Then it's basically to May 2024 is the final date for the one which have transition periods. So, as I said before, it sounds like several years to work on this, but time is running fast. And remember still that you are not alone on this. Most companies are in this situation, and there are limited number of notified bodies. There are also the issues with not releasing new products, etc. So if you haven't started to work on this heavily, it's time to do that now. I would say it's probably one of the last calls right now. At the same time, just don't rush into it. Plan and act and implement to reduce the issues. If you just rush into it without any thoughts, then you can actually cause lots of issues in the company, and you can actually get out in a really bad situation later on. So make sure that you really plan the things you're supposed to do, that you involve the whole organization. What do you want to do here to ensure that you don't just smack in a new software system, for instance, and then it doesn't work that well for the organization, because that can add lots of extra costs. If you do it right, you will actually be more efficient, and then you can save cost in the end. But if you do it wrongly, it can almost kill the company, I would say. So ensure that you identify what are your needs in the area, what is the need you have today, what are the needs needed from the future part, like UDI, what will that be needed? So ensure that you have the competence partner which know what's needed and how good look like. What are your gaps? I haven't been in one company in my life which haven't had gaps. So every company has some kind of gaps. It's not just to make sure that you try to reduce the gaps as far as possible when you actually do this anyway. And also look through how do you want to work in the future, meaning that if you already now think about ways of working which differs from what you do today, try to look into how that look like, because otherwise, if you implement a new way of working, new way of handling systems and new systems, make sure that the new systems actually covers the way you want to work in the future, because otherwise it seems to be meaningless to do it and costly. So final words there in this short presentation, the key takeaways. Time is very limited. Looks like it's several years, but it's if you don't start to act now, then these years are not that long time actually, considering all the different things. But it's still possible to make a difference. If you haven't started, that still have opportunities to do things, but it's starting to get late to do things. So you need to actually work now on these things. But the key thing here also, my key message is, do not rush into something, because you need to live with these things for a long time. So make sure that you do correct planning. Don't let the quality and regulatory affairs department run this in isolation. Make sure that you have an experienced product leader to do this. And I think the quality and regulatory affairs people are the SMEs in this, but they should not be running the product itself. And the reason is that this is a business product. It's not actually a quality and regulatory affairs part. They are only handling certain things in the process. But the key thing is the business needs to own these things, because that's where most of the activities actually happens. And that's also, if you don't have everyone on the same boat, you will experience lots of issues. And of course, when you actually have the possibilities to change things, make sure you change to something better that are compliant, instead of change to something which are compliant but much worse way of working, because that will cost money and time. And that's of course very important for every company to keep track on. That was basically what I would like to say. I'm not sure if there are any questions come up here. And I'm not sure if you, Rian, do you have any questions for me right now?
I think this was great. Thanks very much, Peter, for sharing your expertise, your insights and recommendations for companies within this industry on how to tackle these challenges. So thanks very much. Really appreciate it. So when it comes to, well, you just shared some recommendations on how to move forward. Could you share a little bit about, do you know what is you showed the chart where it says how many certificates are due in I think it was 2024, and actually that there is a shortage of maybe notified bodies, etc. What is the, do you know any figures or anything where how many companies have actually started embarking on this journey now to actually tackle these challenges and mitigate the risks? How many companies have actually applied for MDR?
The latest figures I saw was a little bit after the summer. And what I could see was that about 3% of the companies have applied for MDR that needs to apply. Another 10% are in the progress to apply, meaning that there are about 85% of the companies that needs to have a notified body have not even applied yet.
Wow, that seems like a huge number. Would you say how will the notified bodies then be able to? I guess they will become sort of a bottleneck when everyone will, start to apply.
For sure, and the graphs also shows that most of these companies are actually still living on the MDD certificate, and they still have not applied, which means that in my mind it's more, if they have not applied, they're probably not ready yet. And the problem here is that the speed to get new notified bodies approved, it takes quite a long time, and actually right now, all the bigger notified bodies are approved, meaning that it's much more smaller player which are the one which are not approved yet. And if you look into currently a little bit over 20 notified bodies approved, there are another 25 which have applied. So I think it's more, it probably comes up to like 50 in 5 years time. But all the other 20s are the smaller players, meaning that they don't have that much people working with this area. So I would say the ones which are approved right now have about 80% of the MDD markets today. So they are the big ones, and the smaller ones, of course, can grow. I mean, the growth opportunity for these guys. But at the same time, the number of people working with these kind of activities are not that many, to be honest, because every company needs to hire lots of like regulatory affairs people to handle this, like PRRC persons, and the same. The authority needs people, the companies need lots of people, and the notified body needs people. So it's a fight of resources there. And the companies need a fewer number, so they are prepared to pay them much higher. The notified body needs, all of these needs to be technical expert, basically. So, and of course, they will not be able to pay everyone that much. Because that's if they need to pay everyone that much, they need to raise the prices, and that's what we have seen. The price is going from MDD to IVD or MDR is much higher. It's at least 50% increase of the costs directly, and it's not uncommon to have at least 1 million SEK for reviewing technical files.
I see. So time is of the essence. And how would you then how would this then affect, if we then look into future innovations, or companies that are companies who now deliver products or maybe are developing products? How can this affect in turn the life sciences industry, having these challenges?
I think short term, mid-term, I mean now from until 5 years in the future, I think the problem here is that the notified bodies, of course, the first customers to take is already existing customers, because they have some kind of obligations, you could say, towards these. Meaning that if you are right now development of a new super product, you don't have a notified body, and you are probably last in line, because you're a new company, they don't have any relation to the notified body, and you have a complex product. And this basically means that you have a very, very interesting journey ahead, I would say. And this basically means that it will take time to get there, and you really need to plan and go out and try to already now secure the notified body part. Because that will be a bottleneck, and it will be one extra new hurdle, I would say, for these kind of companies, which didn't exist a couple of years ago. So that it will take longer time for new technology, and before we actually are used to the new normal, it will take more time. I was old enough to be part of the old regulation when MDD came, and things was similar situation from companies. Everyone said that this will kill the medical device industry, life science industry. Of course, that didn't happen, and the reason is that the companies, of course, adapt to this. But it takes in transition period, it takes time for companies to learn what they need to do and how they can manage these things. So it's always a transition risk for lots of companies going from an old way of working to a new way of working. The only thing we know for sure is that the documentation level, the administrative part, will go up. The more documentation needed, more updates. To keep products live needs more efforts. And this, of course, is always that you need to work much more with the documentation. And that's more because today you have a product with documentation. And if you don't have the documentation, you don't have a product. Meanwhile, in the 90s, you had the product and perhaps not one single document for the product. But now it's equally important to have the documentation in place.
I see. Well, thanks very much, Peter. I know time is running out, but it seems like, just like I mentioned earlier, time is of the essence. Seems like we need to focus to have the right tools, processes in place to manage this administrative burden in a more efficient manner. So again, thank you very much, Peter, for being on stage and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you, Sal, for to be participating in the conference.